Hi, everybody. I just want to take us to part two of the French Revolution, because in this episode, you're seeing the rise of what's called the Enlightenment. And for light, think about this light bulb. It represents what? Ideas, right? Ideas, new ideas that people have that question authority. So the Enlightenment is a really important influence to why the French Revolution happened. And you will need to tell the story of what are all these different parts that influenced the French Revolution. And one of the biggest parts was just all these philosophers who started to question society and government, which was then a king, through ideas of reason, right? Logically thinking out, like, why is it that people think that humans don't have rights? Who should have rights? Even during this time, we're talking about Europe, and we're talking about mostly men, white men. So even though a lot of these philosophers did believe that all people were equal, it wasn't as many as there are now, right? We're still talking 200 years ago. People had very racist, sexist notions of what humans were perceived as equal to them, right? And women and anybody of color was not usually in there. Although that's not true for some, and I'll talk about them as well. But here is a famous quote: "Man is born free, but everywhere in chains." This was a guy called Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau, as Americans would say, basically believed that you are born, as a blank slate, but you are free, a blank slate that can be basically free or trapped by society. So he kind of represents a lot of these different theorists. So you're watching the French Revolution documentary. As you're doing that, think about the ways in which humans have been questioning authority since the beginning of the slideshow, right? What do you remember about the Greeks? What do you remember about the Romans? What do you remember about Martin Luther? What did he question? What do you remember about the scientists, the scientific revolution that came right before this? So that's what you're going to answer here. This was a guy, Thomas Hobbes. This handsome fellow believed that humans, I think of him as like a nasty little hobbit, just because I try to remember Hobbes, Hobbit. But he believed that man is basically brutal and savage and selfish and greedy. He grew up during these religious wars between Catholics and Protestants in Europe. And he saw life as just one ending struggle, like never ending struggle, rather, of trying to get to the top and trying to work your way through it. And humans were so selfish and so mean and so cruel that they needed a leader who was going to take control and be strong and not let people get away with anything, because people couldn't control themselves. That's what he believed. So for him, the idea was a king or a queen. And the people should give up certain rights in order to be governed with security and laws that the queen thinks are important. So security and order for him were more important than human rights. So he's important to remember, because he's the first one to come up with the idea of a contract, a social contract. Whereas I'm a little person and I'm going to basically give my leader my freedom in exchange for order, law and order. So that's Thomas Hobbes. Now, along comes, he's one of the first philosophers. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Believes that men are inherently evil. In a pre-social world, basically, he believes that even without any training, anybody raising you in any way whatsoever, if we were to leave a bunch of kids on an island, they would be savage. They would constantly be at war. And they needed a strong monarch to basically keep them in check, to make sure they didn't kill each other. So that's his idea of a social contract. The contract is basically it's a contract, a piece of paper that I'm going to give saying, I agree you should do this in exchange for this. Okay, so for him, it was the ruler will provide security and order in exchange for all your freedom and rights. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau thinks something different. He believes that man is basically a noble savage. You are pure, but you are wild, and it's all up to who raises you as far as what happens to you. Are you good or are you bad? It depends on society, but he does believe that society in general, and remember this is back in the 1700s, that they're corrupting people. Society and culture is corrupting men. Men meaning humans. So his idea of a social contract is like there should be a social contract, but he believes, because he believes that people are born free, right? He believes that the ruler should act for the people. So basically, this is an agreement. His social contract was an agreement that the people should be the ones to decide what's happening to them, and they want the ruler to do it. And the ruler has to abide by that, or they should no longer be in power. Okay? So basically, he's agreeing with the Greeks way back then that every single citizen should have the right to make laws and to vote on things. Okay? Now, John Locke. John Locke is where we get a lot of our thoughts from in America. He agrees with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but he goes one step further. He writes this book called Two Treatises of Governments, and he has the totally different viewpoint of Thomas Hobbes. Remember, Thomas Hobbes, evil little hobbit, he needs a king to rule him. For John Locke, think of a lock, okay? I think of a lock. I always try to think of mnemonic devices to remember. He unlocks three things. He unlocks your things that you are born with. Basically, believing that you're equal to everybody else, that you have an innate natural morality. You are going to be moral as a natural order, which means you have rights to life, liberty, and property. And property was a huge part back then because nobody had property except the landowners. And they kept that, and that's how wealth was generated, right? And of course, it's going to be another 200 years before women have access to that or anybody of color. But all that while, all that wealth is accumulating in land. And he recognized that land was the way to build the wealth. So that's the three rights that they unlock. Government gets their authority, just like John Locke said, government gets authority from the people. Okay, so very different views here. So people who are influenced by him include Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin. Many of the founders of the USA are influenced by this idea that all people have the right, all white men have the right to life, liberty, and property. US is going to change that to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The purpose of government is to protect the people, right? Natural human rights. And here's something else he says. He says, if the king or queen is not, or whoever you give your liberties, whoever is ruling for you, right? If they give you all your liberties and freedoms, he hadn't thought of the idea of a president yet. But for that leader, if they are not giving you all those freedoms, then what he said is you have the right to rebel against them. So that's what happens with the American Revolution, right? The king does not want to give the people any power. So he's basically not changing anything, not changing the way we do taxes, taxing the Americas, taking the money back to England, and the people finally rebel and they have a revolution and they kick out the British and they have independence, and that becomes the US. So basically the idea, again, just like the Romans, all men are equal before the law. Uh-oh, that's why is that going? I don't know how to get that away there. Although not every man is equal. And I keep going back to that because you hear these enlightened philosophers all the time in all their writing. They're talking about all men are created equal. But they're not really, because they're not considering people of color as equal to them. They're not considering women as equal to them. So just keep that in mind. So what I would like you to do here is just an image that represents John Locke. I made the face for Hobbes. John Locke, right? What does he believe? That's what you're going to do in this one. Now you're going to look at Voltaire. Voltaire was a playwright. He wrote plays, and he wrote plays in a way that challenged what people believed. And he was actually working for the king of France. And the French would have him come to their Versailles palace, and he would do these hilarious skits. But they were all making fun of the king or the church. And the king didn't really get that. He just thought it was funny. He was laughing. But he's all about, and he's actually the most open-minded of all of these guys, because he also does believe in like abolishing slavery, for one, which was a huge thing that none of these guys would touch. But he did not, and he especially did not like the control of the church. So he strongly believes in religious tolerance, civil rights, and free speech, right? And they were as essential as people thought that a king was. So those three, okay? He was a total womanizer, by the way. I'm covering his picture up here, but you can kind of see that even in his portrait. It's rumored that he had all these affairs with all these other the queen of Russia used to write to her. She wanted to be all enlightened. So anyway, let's keep going so that I don't get too far behind here. So you're illustrating the concept of Montesquieu. Montesquieu has 3 syllables. Say it out loud. Montesquieu. He goes back to this idea in Rome that, do you remember what the Romans said? The 3 branches of government. He says, if you are going to create a society, you need to have those 3 branches of government that Rome had way back when. Nobody's been talking about those forever. So anyway, he basically says you need to, where's my little picture I carry around all over the place here? I don't know. Basically, you need to divide up the power. 3 branches of government. That's what Montesquieu is saying. So remember it that way, okay? He basically says the king will execute the laws, but that Parliament or Congress should write the laws, and then the courts should decide whether or not they're fair. So separation of powers. When you see this, you think Montesquieu, think separation of powers, okay? Illustrate Montesquieu. Beccaria. You think Beccaria, think Bacardi. Here's why. Bacardi is a rum, and if you all drink it, it's illegal and you're going to go to jail. Beccaria was all about prison and what your rights are in prison. He's one of the first ones to basically say that people in prison have rights. So he says that if you are accused of a crime, you are not guilty right away. You are innocent until you are proven guilty. He strongly advocates against anything to do with the way that people have punished criminals. Now, remember, it was very, very unfair. Basically, the king got to decide who was in charge. But he says not only should you be innocent until proven guilty, there should be no torture, because anybody's going to confess to anything under torture. There should be no capital punishment. And there should be a capital punishment is executions, right? Execute somebody. And no unequal treatment because you are wealthy, right? You have wealthy, you have the power for a lawyer. These people don't. So that's what that is. He's all about the criminal justice reform. So connect him, Beccaria, he was Italian. But connect him to illegal, I think of that Bacardi just to make the connection again. So on his book called Crimes and Punishment, he was immediately popular among a lot of these enlightened thinkers, the philosophers and political leaders. This is his quote. You're going to read this yourself and analyze this and underline different passages. Mary Wollstonecraft is the first woman to come along and basically write an amazing book about why women should be in this category of equal treatment under the law, including, and especially for her, was access to education. Until like this time, women were not chosen to be educated. They're not going to earn any money outside the home. So why would we want to educate our girls? But she says that starts, the opportunities for women start in school. So they needed to have equal opportunities in school. They need to, and she challenged all these other like philosophers about like how equal people were, and basically said that women have to be in politics, because if they're not involved as representatives for the people, then they are not going to, women are never going to be moving up unless there are people who represent them in power. Thomas Jefferson, he agrees that basically the ideal government is an independent republic, right? The idea that, and here's the key, an intellectual aristocracy. Oops. So he's arguing for still the landowners who were citizens in America, right? A strict constitutional constitutional system. But basically it should be limited. So emphasis on individual freedom and responsibility of states' rights. That all goes back to John Locke. So the idea of dividing up not just the three branches of power, but the states, the governors could all have their own power as well. That's an important Jeffersonian thought. So basically, think about all of these ideas that are starting to come around. Americans are traveling to France. French are traveling to the UK, right? And a lot of these philosophers are coming out of France, they're coming out of Italy, and they are all being discussed in these fancy tea houses. It's like a salon. This is a tea house in Paris, but they were run by women. But the salons of Paris were a place where people would meet to discuss these ideas. And it was among the aristocracy. It was the nobility. The people who were actually making these decisions were the educated classes of men predominantly that are sharing these ideas around and basically sharing the books, kind of the today social media, sharing it all online, becoming aware of their power that is going to shift now to looking at what are they going to do about it. They are going to bring down the monarchies. So that's what the Enlightenment was all about. This is part 2. Oops. Turn off my machine. Got distracted. Come on, go.